Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan Jeyarajah and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan Jeyarajah, national college football writer for CBS Sports. As always, we're glad to have you with us. Today we're continuing our tour examining all the teams within the Power Four conferences because we're the Survivor Show. We want to know who the potential contenders will be as we enter the 12-team playoff. We've already covered the ACC and the Big 12 and the first half of the Big 10, so be sure to check those previous episodes if you haven't already. But today we're continuing our journey through the Big 10, the biggest 10, the biggest of all the 10s. We've got another guest with us. Ryan Clarke of the Oregonian and Oregon Live joins us. But before we dive in, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Take a moment, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you're hearing us. We always appreciate that. But let's get into it. So Ryan Clarke covers the Oregon Ducks and Big Ten Conference for the Oregonian in Portland and co-hosts Soccer Made in Portland and Ducks Confidential podcast. He grew up in that neck of the woods, the Pacific Northwest of the Big Ten, or the Pac-10, if you will. Ryan, thanks for joining us. I just want to say, I know a lot of Timbers and Thorns fans were genuinely disappointed to lose you on their beat, which, as any sports writer, if you've got fans like sad you're leaving their beat, that's a triumph, man.
Yeah, it makes things bittersweet, right? You move to something that's obviously an exciting beat, and then you have all those people saying that, and then it's like, oh wow, like the emotions really get you there. Because look, that is a close knit soccer community up there in Portland, and it is very special. And regardless of the attention that might be paid to soccer in this country compared with college football, that's something very special. So, being part of that community in that way, as somebody that, I grew up in Portland, but I didn't really know how special it was until I was in it and I realized. And so, yeah, it's also validation too that, you're doing your job right.
Well, I have to ask you, so obviously you're based in Portland, you've covered men's and women's soccer. Have you gotten a chance to go to the sports bra, the all women's sports bar?
I haven't yet. I've written about it. I obviously wrote about when Alexi Ohanian invested in them to build new locations around the country. So that's obviously exciting for them. But no, I haven't had a chance to get out there yet. I definitely want to for a Thorns game or any other event this season, maybe a WNBA game. I've heard it's a really good time over there for sure.
Excellent. Well, Shehan, do you want to share with our guests, just break down the format we've been using for this series?
Absolutely. So, as people who have listened to the past couple episodes will know, we are going to run through every single team in the Big Ten and put them into one of three categories. And that's a college football playoff contender, that's a middle class team, or a bottom tier team. So, we're going to each pick, me and Ryan, one of the three categories for every team that we're going through. And something to remember is that we are in a new era. The college football playoff is 12 teams. This isn't the same as, well, you have to just be Ohio State or Michigan to make the college football playoff. Other teams are going to have a chance. And also, by the way, there's some exciting new additions, including the one that Ryan covers, who might have something to say about that conversation as well. So just to run through what we did on our last episode, where we ran through the first half of the Big Ten, we only picked two playoff contenders out of the 9. That's Ohio State and Penn State. And as our listeners may remember, our Penn State beat writer actually was very low on Penn State being a potential college football playoff contender, but Bobak was the deciding vote. He was able to push it through. In the middle tier, we had Minnesota, Michigan, Iowa, Northwestern, Nebraska. Very rare for the defending national champions not to be in the college football playoff contender conversation, but a lot has changed there. And then in the bottom tier, we actually only had 2 teams, and that's Rutgers and Indiana. So a lot still out there. I'm going to be fascinated to see today because I'll tell you what, we invited Ryan on. He obviously covers Oregon. We decided to saddle him with all 4 of the Pac-12 schools that are transitioning over. And then again, I mean, this is going to be so fascinating also just getting such a large number of those teams from the legacy Big Ten West as well, who maybe haven't been in the Big Ten conversation or in the college football playoff conversation. It'll be interesting to see where everybody works themselves out. So to recap, playoff contender, middle tier, bottom rung, and I'm excited to see how many end up making each tier.
Absolutely. So why don't we start this out with one of the new arrivals, one of the two instigators, you might argue, of all of these shifts, the USC Trojans. Now, the Trojans obviously had the reigning Heisman Trophy winner last season, but it didn't quite go to plan because they certainly didn't have the reigning defense of a championship team. They went 8-5, 5-4 in conference. They had a decent bounce in that Holiday Bowl. We saw Miller Moss seemingly set himself apart and scare away any other potential quarterback transfers other than Jaden Mayava from UNLV. But Lincoln Riley, this is big third season for him. They were able to poach Danton Lynn from across the street, or across town, really, and Eric Henderson from the Rams to kind of shore up that defense. They're opening with LSU in Vegas, and they have a fairly tough schedule in conference. What do we make of them? How are we going to put them? We're going to call them a contender, middle class, bottom tier. What say you, Ryan?
I'd say middle class for USC at this point. I think that, back when they first joined the Big Ten, they thought, oh, great, we're making this big innovative move that nobody else is definitely going to do this. Like we're going to go into this major conference and contend with the likes of Ohio State and Michigan. And then some other things happened. And then they came up short in terms of both recruiting and transfers, as compared with a lot of those teams that are at the top of that conference. You think about Oregon as a prime example. Now that Oregon's joining them, now that the conference is a little bigger with the challenges that they have, I just don't see them getting out of that middle tier. I think that like an 8-5 season would be a success for this team. Now, for Lincoln Riley, he would not obviously be satisfied with that. And then the seat might get a little bit warmer for somebody of his caliber and expectation, were they to underperform those sort of lofty expectations. But yeah, I genuinely think they're middle of the pack in this Big Ten.
I'll preface with this. I think that USC is undervalued. Like I do. I think that people look at what happened last year and they're like, well, this program's a mess. This program's a disaster. Lincoln Riley's a disaster. USC is dead again. And I don't think it's quite as serious as that, but I do still have them as a middle class team, more towards the top of the middle class, but middle class nonetheless. This is a team, by the way, with Miller Moss taking over, he is not going to be the kind of quarterback that we've been used to Lincoln Riley coaching, but I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. He's more of a traditional pocket type passer, and I think that we might end up seeing a USC offense that is a little more balanced. We've had a lot of conversations about Ohio State and the way that they've moved towards physicality and the run. I think we'll start to see that in some ways from USC in 2024. And look, I think that part of that decision to move away from sort of these high-flying, explosive play-based stuff is also an attempt to protect the defense a little bit too. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that USC's defense is going to be good next season because I don't actually believe that, but I do think that they have a chance to be much improved. Of course, like you mentioned, bringing in Danton Lynn as their defensive coordinator, he was one of the top coordinators in the country last year at UCLA, and it's not just that one guy. They bring in Eric Henderson, the Los Angeles Rams defensive line coach who helped develop Aaron Donald into one of the greatest players of all time. They bring in Matt Entz, the former head coach at North Dakota State, to basically be a head coach of the defense in a lot of ways. So I do think that this is a team that I would certainly buy low on just long term. I think that this will end up being more of a transitionary year than necessarily a delivery year, but I like some of the guys who they have coming back on both sides of the ball. I think that defensively they're going to be improved. And look, I mean, I don't see them getting into Big Ten contention, and eight wins might be the number that we're looking at this year, but I do think it'll be a more encouraging 8 wins or 9 wins potentially than sort of falling into the 8 wins like they did last season.
Yeah, falling into 8 in the Pac-12 is a lot different than winning 8 games in what is going to be a much more competitive conference this year for sure.
Yeah, it's fun to look at the schedule and you see they've got LSU, Michigan, Wisconsin, Penn State, Washington, which we still, who knows, and Notre Dame. And you're like, yeah, no, they will earn a spot if they make it into the playoff. That's all we know, but that might be a tall order this season. So shifting cross town, we have another program, UCLA. They actually finished with an identical 8-5 record, 4-5 in the Pac-12. They're the reigning LA Bowl champs, but apparently that was enough for Chip Kelly. He was willing to go leave and take the offensive coordinator position at Ohio State. So we've got Deshaun Foster, the star running back. I remember when he played for the Bruins. He's now in his first season. He was able to get a big OC get in Eric Bieniemy, which arguably might have even been a good head coaching candidate. They also get LSU on the road, though, purely on the road, not a neutral site game, and a fairly tough slate of games. Where are we going to put the Bruins in this first season for Foster?
Um, I'd say closer to the bottom tier, but with potential for middle tier. I think that there's individual talent here and there that could allow for them to be a sneaky upset contender, a potential giant killer for a team that's got to travel a long way out to Pasadena. But yeah, I just, Chip, when it comes to Chip Kelly, I think he's a good example of a wise man knowing his limitations and being somebody that moves away from a job that obviously being a head coach is more prominent and more powerful than being a coordinator. But if I was him, I think I might have made that move as well, because you think about institutional support, you think about all the different things in college football that are necessary for success now. A move like that, if you don't feel like you have all those things, is probably the right move. As far as this year's UCLA team, yeah, I'd say top end of the bottom tier for me.
Yeah, they're one of the tougher teams for me to try to figure out because the transition was so bizarre. Like it really did feel like a coach just quitting on a team in so many ways, and that team trying to backfill with just a placeholder in some ways. Now, I do think that when you talk about leading a team into the Big Ten, this is, I think, the kind of person who you want in terms of being a face of the program, in terms of being a great fundraiser, bring some excitement. I was a little worried about, he has a reputation of being a good recruiter, but I don't know that we had ever necessarily seen it with consistency. Well, I think that this transfer class helps at least make me feel a little bit better with what they have coming in. I still don't know that I see them being able to make it out of the bottom tier of the Big Ten in 2024. I mean, it's a first-time head coach. There's a lot of moving pieces. They didn't have time necessarily to even hire all of the staff that they wanted just because of how late it happened in the cycle. But I do think that this is a team that that the results don't really matter so much in 2024. It's more about how they're doing things. It's more about talent acquisition. It's more about, can we fundraise to get to where we need to be in the Big Ten? And they're of course going to have they're going to be saddled with calimony, right? They're going to lose $10 million a year sent over to Cal as part of some agreements by the UC system. But I still think that this is a program that I would say this: if Deshaun Foster, obviously, it would be great if he's successful, but if he's unsuccessful, but this job is better in 2 or 3 years, I think that should still be viewed as a success.
Now you got me thinking. It would have been funny if they'd structured calimony payments based on the success of UCLA. That would have made Cal really rooting hard for their old rivals in the UC system, and I don't know, like make it a percentage of revenue generated, or
Yeah, each win is an extra million. Yeah,
we'll try to see UCLA actually try to discourage people from going to the Rose Bowl rather than the other way, where they're desperately trying to get people to attend. Oh my goodness. Well, let's go to a traditional Big Ten member, at least a historic Big Ten member, legacy. I don't know how we're going to call them, but Purdue, the Boilermakers. The first season under Ryan Walters, they went 4-8, 3-6 in the Big Ten. Not great, not terrible for a first season. They've got Notre Dame, the traditional, one of Notre Dame's many rivals in their non-con, but their regular schedule isn't too bad. Where are we going to put the Boilermakers? And I'm also going to note that the Ducks will be playing there on a Friday night. So if you're talking a potential Spoilermakers special, I wanted to toss that one in there. So they've got a couple of their big opponents coming into West Lafayette. But how do we think the Purdue is going to fit?
Yeah, I think under normal circumstances, that has all the feel of a trap game for an Oregon team that has major expectations in the 2024 season. But I view this Purdue team as a decidedly sort of bottom tier in the current Big Ten school. Obviously, their early season schedule is a little bit challenging in stretches. You have the Notre Dame game, you have the Nebraska game and Wisconsin game in that first five. And then obviously Oregon coming to your house. You want to play, as you said, the spoiler maker, but I don't see it happening, particularly given the sort of rhythm and engine that the Ducks are going to have rolling by that point. And then the rest of the schedule isn't all that much easier for them either. I think one narrative that is not oft discussed about the Big Ten getting bigger and becoming a super conference is that it may be a super conference, but in fact it is a little bit bloated in some ways with teams, I think, like Purdue and like some others that we're going to talk about today, that frankly are in the same stratosphere in terms of talent and contention as some of these Pac-12 schools that got left behind. I mean, you think about Oregon State, that's on Purdue's schedule, oddly enough. Oregon State as a program, I think you could argue is in a healthier place, at least before the conference realignment, than one like Purdue's, because they had a level of institutional support and growth of the program that seemed to have a trajectory. So I think that's an interesting undercurrent for all this, but definitely for me, at least a bottom tier.
Well, I do love some stuff right on this roster. Dylan Thieneman as a safety, like he is that dude. Like he is one of the best safeties in the entire country. Coy Beasley, a top 150 player coming in from Cincinnati, Ohio. He's also, I think, going to be a contributor in that unit. So I mean, like they have some stuff that I'm excited about defensively. Offensively, this did not go as I think anybody hoped it would go under Graham Harrell, and this was a program that I felt like just struggled to ever get its feet underneath it under first year coach Ryan Walters. So I do feel like I'm asking myself, am I undervaluing them because of how bad that first year was? I mean, 2 years ago, they were playing in a Big Ten title game. It wasn't that long ago. They've got a quarterback that I have a lot of faith in Hudson Card. They've got another Texan, by the way, coming in at quarterback, and Marcus Davila from Midland, Texas. So, like, I don't feel as hopeless about this team as I did at points last season, especially with some of the talent they were able to attract. I mean, another Nylon Green, a cornerback from Georgia coming in as a guy who played a lot for them. So I think the secondary could be legitimately excellent. I think that they're pretty good at quarterback, but like it's just one of those things where I need to see the pieces come together before I have a lot of faith in it. So I have them in the bottom tier, but I've got like half an eye on them as well.
Well, let's move to another one of these teams in the heart of Big Ten country, Illinois. So the Illini, they went 5-7 last season, 3-6 in the Big Ten. Brett Bielema, it's wild to think he's been there for 4 years. He's always there, and I kind of keep forgetting he's been there now for several years at this point. Their schedule isn't terrible. They got an interesting benchmarking game with Kansas in their non-conference. And then, again, they have 2 tough road games at Penn State and Oregon, but really the rest of their schedule, they host Michigan, which is kind of a mystery program at this point as well. Where do we put the Illini?
I think they'd into if I had to power rank everybody out, I think they'd be just above UCLA or in the same type of range, the bottom end of the middle tier, with a ceiling of straight up middle tier and being a, if things go well, 7-8 win type team. But it's hard for me to imagine that happening with this Illinois team. It is weird. You mentioned Bielema being there for 4 years now. I feel like we're in this like pandemic, like time warp thing where like everything that happened between 2019 and 2023 all happened in like the same year. And I have no conception of time or anything anymore, especially when it comes to sports, because sports is measured in these year by year things. And it's like, well, he's played for this team for that long, or, she's coached this team for that long. And it's just like, it just doesn't register for me anymore. But yeah, Illinois, lower end of the middle tier for me.
Yeah, they're a weird team. I mean, you look at their wins last year in Big Ten play. It's like a 3-point win, a 1-point win, and a 3-point win against not awesome teams. Like I don't know what that is. I don't know exactly how excited I should be about a team like that. And by the way, they lost one of the best defense players in the country in Jerzon Newton, who just left for the NFL as well. Also, their top rusher Reggie Love actually transferred to Purdue. So I don't know what this team is going to be necessarily. I don't see them being the kind of elite defensive unit that they were 2 years ago, especially, but even into last year. It feels like since that 2022 season where they had a real up, they've kind of just been almost coasting from that. Like it doesn't feel like they added very much to it last season, and now they enter a year in 2024 where really all of the pieces from that team are now gone. So for me, they are a bottom tier team. I just haven't seen what I've needed to see in terms of star development behind some of the guys that they had 2 years ago and into last season as well. I mean, I do think the one thing you have to say about Illinois is that they know their identity, they know what they want to accomplish, they know how they're going to try to control games, but it's just such a low margin of error type of game that they end up playing. And by the way, like their schedule is so much harder this year than it's been in previous years. At Nebraska, at Penn State versus Michigan, at Oregon. Like they still have a good amount of the legacy Big Ten West on their schedule, but they even have Kansas in non-conference play, which is a game that I don't think is going to go very well for them. So I have them in the bottom tier, though. Again, they're more of a, like you kind of mentioned, they're more of a top end bottom tier team with the ceiling of being in the middle, but right now I don't think they deserve it.
So, do I need to step in now? It sounds like we had a middle class and a bottom tier vote. Boy, oh boy. I am going to give a little bit of the benefit of the doubt to the Illini. I think they're going to be in that middle class this season. I think I the schedule's tough, but not as tough as some of the others out there. And I think they could. I mean, I'm not. I mean, I don't think they're going to ascend much out of the middle class. I think they're going to just stay in the middle. But I'm gonna tie break them, and I'll put the Illini at the in the middle class for this season. Maybe they'll prove me wrong, and not in a good way. Who knows? We'll see. But all right, moving on along. Let's wrap up this first group with Bielema's old team, Wisconsin, the Badgers. So Luke Fickell's first season, they went 7-6. 5-4 Big Ten. They are our ReliaQuest Bowl runner-ups. This season, they're bringing in Tyler Van Dyke from Miami. Phil Longo, we'll see what he can do with him as a coach. They've got one of the tougher schedules out there because their non-conference is definitely highlighted by a visit from Alabama. And then they're going to USC. They've got Penn State, at Iowa, and Oregon. My goodness, there was an interesting one. So what can we expect from the Badgers?
I think you can expect a lot of people on College Game Day and ESPN and all the different people that cover college football to be talking about strength of schedule with this team, like you highlighted, and for that to be, I think, something that could be a boon for them to be in that playoff contender category. I'm not going to put them there, but I think that they are in the upper end of the middle tier in the Big Ten in such a way that a few things go their way, a few things go the wrong way for another team, and you're talking about them being in that 12 to 15 national ranking range. Wisconsin has a great history as a program, and they have a lot of opportunities in this season to show their mettle and to compete with the likes of elite programs like Alabama, like Oregon, that they're going to go toe to toe with. So I think that they're in the upper part of the middle tier, but would not be surprised if they're in that conversation come winter.
It was a weird first season, I think, for Luke Fickell in this program. And they, of course, brought in Phil Longo, the Badgerite, as they called it. Like, it just didn't seem to ever really come together. Their quarterback, Tanner Mordecai, had some injury issues, but wasn't very good when he played as well. And Tyler Van Dyke is a very flawed football player coming in from Miami, but I think that he also just gives them a level of talent that they did not have last year as a thrower. He's not going to be asked to do anything all that special in this offense, which I think is going to be a good thing for him. The other thing to mention, Braylon Allen, their fantastic running back, off to the NFL, so that's a little bit of a concern for me. And on the offensive line, like this hasn't looked like a Wisconsin team in 5 years, right? Like it's been a hot minute since this looks like a Wisconsin offensive line. That's something that they need to address. Defensively is where I'm excited about them. They were pretty good last year. I think that they have a good amount of guys coming back, some interesting ads as well. So the issue, like we talked about, and like Ryan mentioned, is that schedule. I probably see 3 games on that schedule that I don't think they have the ability to win. And that's Alabama, maybe I'll be wrong, but Penn State and versus Oregon. Now, all 3 of those games are at home. So maybe you nab one. I don't know. But then you also go to USC and to Iowa, which are 2 games that I think are losable. And maybe even at Nebraska. We'll get to them in a little bit. So I think that this is a really nice 9-3 team, most likely. And that's not quite enough to get them into that playoff conversation. But I think it is a season that would make everybody feel pretty good about where Luke Fickell is going.
Yeah, and I think that if they are 9-3, with those 3 games being the losses, I think that they're at the very least on the bubble.
Sure.
Whether you count that bubble like as like 13 to like 17 or 18, or if you count it as like literally right 13 or 14. But yeah, I with the schedule like that, I definitely think they'd be a bubble team, which is crazy. Like that the bubble is now 12 teams. just like I'm still wrapping my head around it at this point that we're going to be talking about the playoff in those terms. But
one thing we talked about on the podcast too is like the presentation of that by ESPN when they actually like put out the broadcast and put up graphics. Like I'm going to be fascinated to see, like, do we have a first 4 out sort of graphic, for example? I think that's going to be a dynamic with the 12-team playoff that I think is going to be a lot of fun.
Love it. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, when we come back, we will wrap up our Big Ten series with the final 4 teams here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, so let's go ahead and move on to another of these. Well, it's so funny. I mean, do we call them an old Big Ten team or a middle-aged Big Ten team? I'm not even sure where to put them, but we're going across to the Atlantic coast for Maryland, the Terrapins. Now, they went 8-5 last season. They had a good bounce off that Music City Bowl victory over Hugh Freeze and the Auburn 11. Mike Loxley's in his 6th season. They're now in the 2nd season of the Josh Gaddis, Kevin Sumlin offense. Their non-conference schedule isn't too bad. They've got UVA, kind of a traditional rival of theirs before they became a Big Ten member. They've got USC coming to town. They're then crossing the country to go and play at Oregon. They've got Iowa, and then they're they're heading over to Penn State to end their season. Where do we put those Terps?
I think the schedules is pretty up and down for them. So I think they're right sort of in the smack dab middle tier, right? Like the seeing them in 9th or 10th would be the most fitting thing to me for this Maryland team. They do have that advantage of making it a long freaking way to go for those West Coast schools. I think of USC having to make that journey when we were talking about USC earlier, and their need to sort of break through that ceiling this year to meet the lofty expectations that Lincoln Riley set for the program. That's one of those games that I'd be concerned about if I was a USC fan. I'm pretty sure it's got like an insane kickoff time too, for people that will be tuning into that one. So, but yeah, I think Maryland, in that hardy middle tier. So,
no, I think that they are a program long term that I'm very excited is getting out of the shadow of the Big Ten East, because they were just fed to the wolves every single year, man. Like they were kind of that first team out in a lot of ways, just because like you're not beating Ohio State or Michigan or Penn State. So like I do love the fact that they're out from under the thumb of all those programs. And I mean, yeah, you look at like their new schedule without all those teams, it's not crazy, right? Like it's not ridiculous. At Oregon, of course, a game that they're going to lose, at Penn State, but like they have winnable games on that schedule for the first time in a little while. Now they applied for Talia Tagovailoa to get another year of eligibility, and if they had managed to get it, I'd probably feel a little better about this team. Instead, they've got MJ Morris, the NC State transfer, coming in instead, and he's a promising player, but not one who I think is necessarily ready to be a like major contributor coming back as well. So this is a team that I definitely see being in the middle tier. They're one that I'm excited about long term, but I just can't quite get there on them until I just see a little bit more from that offense and see kind of what their plan is long term at quarterback.
It's so funny too because we were talking about this with Rutgers last time, where if there was like for some of the teams in the former Big Ten West, they're looking at now this forest full of predators that they've been released into now that they're in the same Big Ten East. But at the same time, teams that were formerly in the Big Ten East, like Rutgers and Maryland, are climbing out of that forest with scratches all over them, realizing there's an open space where maybe they can thrive. So maybe that'll be it for these turtles. There's only so much they could take when they were in there. And then one other just comment, I did get some humor out of the idea potentially how USC could be scheduled. I think Maryland's called it their homecoming game. And I just like last time when we were talking about, well, when will Rutgers schedule their UCLA game when they come into town? I would love to see them even though they don't do them on the East Coast, do an 11 a.m. kickoff. Just do one, just so that these players kicking off their body clock. It's going to be like 8 a.m. It's like, why am I even here? Oh,
yeah,
my
their
goodness.
body clocks would be destroyed. And then the fans, of course, out here on the West Coast would be infuriated, to say the least, that they have to roll groggily out of bed.
One of the West Coast teams has scheduled one of the East Coast teams for like a almost 8 p.m. kickoff local. So it's going to be
that might have been the game that I was thinking of when I was talking about Maryland and USC. I believe USC has a game on its schedule against Rutgers. Now that I am remembering,
Yeah.
That is an 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. in New Jersey kickoff. The Scarlet Knights just absolutely just left in the dust.
Oh my
Well,
goodness.
I'm fascinated to see too. Do we see a turnaround that's the Saturday late night game translated to then playing a Friday late night game? Like that's going to be, I think, brutal for some of these teams as well. So look, we talk a lot about the SEC and how they're ruining the sport, but man, the Big Ten with television, they are going to put their middle class teams through a meat grinder.
See, I like weaponizing scheduling. They do it in international soccer all the time. I loved when when U.S. Soccer hosted Honduras out here in Minnesota in like what was the coldest soccer game ever for a competition for a FIFA qualifier, and it was spectacular. So I'm all for weaponizing scheduling. I'm all for it. Oh my goodness! All right, so let's move on to again one of the new teams arriving in the Big Ten, the reigning national runner-ups, Washington Huskies, 14-1. Obviously, they managed to beat the Ducks twice last season. They've got a whole new lineup at the coaching staff, though. We've got Jed Fish, and we've got almost like it always feels like when you look at their coordinators, it's like the next generation of names. It's like Star Trek Next Generation. It's Washington, the next generation. We've got Brendan Carroll on the offense coordinator, Stephen Belichick as defense coordinator. They lost some key guys. Jabbar Muhammad, we'll probably talk about in a little bit. Parker Brailsford, Jeremy Bernard. They've kept some others. Their schedule is not great. The nice thing is they kept the Apple Cup. It's a non-conference game now. The not so great is they host a rematch of the national championship game with Michigan coming into town. They go to Iowa. They host USC. They're at Penn State. And then, of course, they've got the rivalry game at Oregon. Where do we place these guys? We had the same thing with Michigan. It's like they were like literally at the top of college football not all that long ago, but we're heading into a new season. Where do we place the Huskies?
I think firmly middle tier. I think that this is a team that has, as you pointed out, a brutal schedule for a first year head coach and for a staff that is making a transition. Similarly, I think to USC is making a transition, as Sean pointed out. But even more so, I think, because of so much of the turnover that has occurred. There's been a lot of turnover in contending programs around the country, but I think that the level of turnover with this Washington program within not only the roster but the coaching staff is going to lead to some up and down, some frustrating moments for Husky fans that have been treated to some great football the last couple of years, and them beating Oregon 2 years in a row, 3 times in a row. I think Dan Lanning may or may not have that circled in red pen about 50 times on his calendar, that game, even if he may not admit it publicly. So it's going to be rough in stretches for the Huskies, but I think they're firmly in the middle tier.
Yeah, this is one of the weirdest national title game rematches that I can ever remember, where nobody is anything like they were in that national championship game. And you know, I am a big Jed Fish believer, but like this is the 2023 TCU, right? Where just like every single player who matters on that team is gone. And I don't know that you can. I mean, first of all, I don't even know that you can backfill to the level that you need to with a roster like that when you aren't one of these super duper duper level recruiting programs, which Washington is not. And the other thing too is like, at least when you looked at TCU last year, it was the same coaching staff. They were able to capitalize in recruiting, and that's not really something that was able to happen at Washington. Now, they did bring in the number 11 transfer class in the country, headlined by Will Rogers, who I I don't love that fit personally. I don't know how he's going to function in a Jed Fish offense. That's a huge step back from my perspective versus a guy like Noah Fafita, who played in this offense last season. They have some interesting pieces on defense that they have coming in, but I just don't know how you can think that this is all going to come together quickly. You know, we had our conversations about Colorado and trying to slap together a team and trying to do it for a second straight year. This is in some ways like trying to slap together a team on the fly. And I I just can't see them being much higher than middle class. Though, I mean, look, the other thing to point out was that Kalen DeBoer sure managed to take over a program that was losing a lot and put it all together and went 11-2 and then made a national title game 2 years later. But this is just to me a more depleted program just because of circumstance than anything really that you can look at across even the rest of the conference.
Yeah, and I think that their young coaching staff has the ability to build a strong foundation for sure with UW. I think that we talked before about institutional investment. There is a lot of institutional investment in sports, particularly football at UW. They are going to be in these games against Oregon every year that 3-4 years down the line are going to have a lot of Big Ten championship implications. It might not even take that long. It could be 2 years, but this is not the year. They're middle tier for sure.
Well, moving to a team that is actually now being helmed by a former Pac-10 coach or Pac-12 coach from your neck of the woods, Michigan State. So they'll want to forget. They wanted to forget the 2023 season before it even began because that was just a, a complete dumpster fire of off the field, on the field, just everything on fire. And they saved their worst losses for their rivals because they were shut out by both Michigan and Penn State in a game. That Michigan game, I mean, all that's ever going to be remembered about it is they accidentally put a Hitler graphic on the scoreboard before the game. I mean, like Michigan State just could not win no matter what they did. I mean, I love it. They even found out, like, well, we were using something without permission to run a trivia thing on the scoreboard. Oh, that doesn't sound better, guys. That doesn't sound better. But now we've got Jonathan Smith, which is one of those hires. I remember everyone was like, okay, yeah, I can see that. And he's bringing his offensive coordinator, Brian Lindgren. He took the Minnesota defensive coordinator, Joe Rossi. So they've got a promising staff there. They've got some good transfers. He was able to bring Aiden Childs from Oregon State. They've got Tommy Schuster from North Dakota State, another good player. Their non-conference schedule isn't terrible. It's going to be another interesting, if you want to call it a benchmark game, when they go to Boston College. And then they have kind of a row of tough games when they've got to go host Ohio State, head over to Oregon, host Iowa, and then play at Michigan. So the middle of that schedule is going to be pretty tough. Can the Spartans climb up to a new standing, or are they still at the bottom?
I think that they're a middle tier team. I think that Oregon State fans, Beaver fans, they were obviously heartbroken to lose Jonathan Smith. It was what was the beginning of a death knell for so many sports at Oregon State with the result of this realignment. And it came so soon after the Oregon State game that it just stung even worse. And Jonathan Smith will get another chance to bring a team to Autzen this year. That's one I will not be at. That is the day of my wedding, so I will not be at Autzen Stadium. Shout out to my fiance Emma. We are getting married on October 3rd. So after it got flexed to Friday, a lot of my guests that at that wedding are pretty upset, having either gone to Oregon or being Oregon fans, because they're gonna have to stream that thing on their phone while I'm up there saying my vows. But Jonathan Smith is a quality coach, and I think an exciting hire for Michigan State if all the pieces fall into place. If the athletic program can sort of right the ship and not deal with as many of the off-field concerns as you touched on. But yeah, middle tier season for them. Don't think they're winning that game when they come to Oregon. I won't be paying attention to it, that's for sure. And that 4-game stretch that you talked about in the middle of their schedule is brutal. So middle tier.
Well, I'll tell you what. I love college football. I watch it every single week. I watch like 10, 15 games a day. Uh, don't even please don't try to watch college football. I promise that being married and going to a wedding is more important than whatever the hell is happening in a college football game on a Saturday. I actually missed Red River for the first time in like 5 years last year because I went to my cousin's wedding in London, and do you know what? I did not miss it for 1 second. So it's okay. We can have a week off college football. Although I will say too, good job not booking October 12th when Ohio State comes to town. That
yes, we will be back from the honeymoon in time for the Ohio State
that
game,
one would be that one. Listen, again, I'm fully supportive of fall weddings, but just good decision on that part. Anyway, to Michigan State.
I just want to say I was married in June, for the record. But
I was married in June too. Actually, my anniversary is this Saturday, and we picked June because it was great. But I will tell you too, you're up in Oregon. I was married in Texas, and June was a brutal time to get married. And by the way, just also, the AC went out at the wedding because, of course, it did. So
no,
June in Texas, no AC. It was, but you know.
Wow.
Yeah, you're already sweating through your suit, and at that point, it's just like, forget it. Like, never take the jacket off, or it's the house of horrors. Thankfully, in Oregon, it's pretty dry in October. We should be fine. Oregon weather is unpredictable, but thanks to our good pal climate change, October is no longer a fall type month. It's sort of like summer extra for Oregonians. So we should be fine.
Yeah. So I'm sure summer. I'm sure it sounds real tough. It's like 98 degrees out here right now. But anyway, all beside the point. Let's take it up to Lansing. I said it earlier this offseason. Jonathan Smith is my favorite hire of the entire offseason. It was just, it was one of those hires where I was like, you mean he was available? Like you mean that he actually was willing to leave and not every program threw $1 billion at him? Because he did such an incredible job at Oregon State, building that program into a consistent winner. They came just a little short this year, but like we're a really, really good team in the Pac-12. And it kills me that we didn't get to see them continue to build on that at Oregon State. I think he could have been like an all-time type of coach. Now he's going to have the chance to do it, of course, at Michigan State. And there's a lot that I like about that fit. He's at a program where you are a little bit of not an afterthought, but you're second fiddle in your own state, right? Michigan just won a national championship. He's at a program where basketball is also really important. So he's going to have a little time and space, I think, to be able to build up his program. So the thing I love about that is I don't think they're going to be in any rush to try to get this team ready for prime time and to get back to competitiveness. And this is a program, again, that over the past couple of years had been pretty consistently good. Obviously, with a couple of highs and under Mark D'Antonio, they had sort of this consistent run of success. So I think that there is a pathway to winning there that Jonathan Smith will be able to take advantage of. This is a middle tier team to me. They are kind of like, I could see them being not very good this year. I could see them being a 4-win team, for example, but they're going to have a first-year starting quarterback in Aiden Shiles. They're going to have a lot of new pieces on both sides of the ball and a new philosophy. So that doesn't really impact how I actually see them. But I think that they deserve the benefit of doubt of being in that middle tier.
I think that's reasonable. Now let's go ahead and wrap up our Big Ten series
Let
with
me
the
stop you
team.
for a second. So heading into this, I'm just gonna say by acclamation. We said this with Ohio State yesterday. I think we can just assume that Oregon's going to be a CFP contender. Let's just put that out there. You can veto me if you'd like. I don't anticipate that happening, but that puts us in an interesting position looking at the Big Ten right now. 3 playoff contenders, and like they're probably going to have 4 teams. We've only identified 3 playoff contenders of this group. 11 teams in the middle class and only 4 teams in the lower class.
It's middle America. It's middle America. You want this? This is
literally
good
middle. Yes.
Midwest sensibilities here.
Yeah, this is the true mid-American conference, but no, this is such a weird conference, and I will say too, like the 3 that we mentioned, and by the way, like we mentioned, our previous guest tried to say that Penn State was not a college football playoff contender, which would have only left us with Ohio State and Oregon as college football playoff contenders. I was a little higher probably on Michigan potentially coming in, potentially being in that like borderline group, but I did ultimately say they're at the top of my middle tier. So, I mean, let me ask you first, Bobak. I mean, who out of this middle group do you think has the best chance of going into the top group? Because I can't imagine, right, that this is going to be a year where we only have 3 playoff contenders from the Big Ten, because that essentially means those 3 are like have to make it.
Yeah, we've got an interesting situation here where I almost wonder if the Pac-12's biggest problem accidentally got inherited by the Big Ten, which is the middle eating its own. Like, are we going to, because there's so many of these teams where like, we just need a couple of things to break their way. And then, yeah, they'll surprise us and be a CFP contender. And the problem is when I see USC in there, when I see Washington in there, when I see all of these teams that have been in there, there's a history of them just kind of knocking each other out. And that's why the Pac-12 historically kept killing itself before it could ever get a CFP playoff contender for all those years. So that's one of the issues here. I mean, the teams that, again, I wouldn't be surprised if they were to rise up would be Wisconsin, maybe pulling off a few games. Iowa as well. USC, again, as we said, like you pointed out, it's like USC, if they do better, I'm not going to be shocked. But at the same time, I look at their schedule and I'm like, that's still a tall order. We're going to need to see them. I mean, but Wisconsin might be the strongest contender out there, at least if they were to make it. But unless I'm looking at some of the weaker schedules, but, you know, am I going to credibly think Illinois is going to have a shot to climb out? No. This is a difficult one. And maybe we're spotting a trend. Maybe this might be the SEC's year to claw out some extra spots. Or perhaps we had so much good conversation about the Big 12 and ACC. Maybe we're going to see them. I mean, could you imagine if in all of this brouhaha, the ACC ripping itself apart from the inside like it's been infested by an alien, it's actually going to have like 3 teams go in and everyone's going to be like, oh, so Florida State, Clemson, and Louisville or North Carolina State, you know, have made it into the playoff and somehow matched the Big Ten. But let's pull it all down. Who knows? But this is absolutely weird. And I'm not sure what we're seeing here. I don't know if we're predicting something. And if we are, yeah, you heard it here first. But at the same time, you know, I don't know. I'm having a hard time finding that 4th team where I would feel comfortable banking on them.
I think that the biggest thing that is an identifier of why that's the case is that there are 2 contending programs that played in the national championship game last year in Michigan and Washington who are in transition. It's a unique set of circumstances that are happening really only this year, because then of course after this year, if Michigan gets back on its track, you have to put them in the every year CFP contenders. If Washington can follow the type of track that some folks think their young coaching staff can get them on, they're back in there too. And that leads into part of what I was going to talk about with the Ducks, which is this. They've played in 2 national championship games. So those are their 2 best opportunities to win a national championship because they were in the game. This, other than those years, is their best opportunity just by attrition and by the fact that so many of these elite programs, including Alabama now with Kalen DeBoer, are in transition. And Oregon is coming into the Big Ten, I think, as not only a CFP contender, but among the two favorites to win the conference. And you could argue that they have the best roster, top to bottom, in the country. This is an Oregon team that has taken advantage of the moment better than a lot of programs around the country have, that has been through its NIL collective, wink, wink, throwing millions of dollars at transfers and recruiting their socks off over the last few months, not only in the transfer market, but at the high school level as well. But the more important one in the immediate, of course, being the transfer acquisitions. This is Dan Lanning's year to really break through, and then people, the hype that surrounds him to start to live up to that. There's a lot of layers to that with the Ducks, but particularly with that point, talking about the Big Ten only having 3 teams, it's just the nature of the situation.
So I do want to ask about that. And of course, yes, I will put Oregon in my college football playoff contenders group. So Dan Lanning, of course, comes at this moment in 2022 where NIL and all of that has just come to fruition, where obviously Mario Cristobal assembled a roster that was pretty incredible from a recruiting perspective. And they, I mean, people kind of, I think, erase a little bit that Cristobal era. Like, they won multiple Big Ten or Pac-12 titles while Mario Cristobal was at Oregon. This was not a team that was struggling by any means to compete, even if they weren't getting to that national level. So I'm curious from your perspective, because Dan Lanning, I mean, the results speak for themselves, right? Like 22-5 in 2 seasons, a top 16 finish 2 years ago, a top 10 finish last year, 2 bowl victories at Fiesta Bowl last year. How much of this do you credit to, wow, Dan Lanning is just like a genius, incredible person? And how much do you give credit to that this moment with NIL coming in and obviously the money they've been able to raise? And I mean, how much of it is a combination of both?
It's absolutely a combination. I think that Dan Lanning deserves a lot of credit for being the emotional and vocal leader that he is, for being a young coach at the forefront of this new era in college sports, and thriving in that setting. I think that he, you talked about the success that Cristobal had in recruiting. I think that he brings that, improves upon it, and is a better in-game coach than Mario Cristobal was. And so you combine those factors along with the fact that this institutional like pile of money that exists in Oregon with its relationship with Nike and its forward thinking NIL approach over the last couple of years. I think about the scene in Breaking Bad when they go to the storage locker, and Huel, the big security type guy, he lays down on the pile of money. That's essentially what happened when Dan Lanning took the Oregon job. And that's the reason why, even though he was not offered that Alabama job, he's rolling around in that money, because it's not the only thing, but in the last like 2 years, it's pretty much been the only thing. It's a big deal.
I'm weighing it out here that it's not just the Oregon Duck, but they've also got the Oregon Scrooge McDuck. And they've actually got a money bin where their scientists at the university have figured out a way to actually allow someone to swim through the coins and not break every bone in their body, like that.
Yeah.
Now I'm picturing
you're thinking of the Family Guy bit too, where he tries to dive into it, and he's like, it's a great many pieces of solid matter, and his bones are all broken.
All I keep thinking about is, imagine if T. Boone Pickens were still alive, what it would be like at Oklahoma State. That's all I keep thinking about. He passed too soon. He really did, because Phil Knight is finally cashing in, man. He is absolutely.
I will say too, and I was actually having this conversation about NBA owners yesterday. There is a level, there's levels to this wealth stuff, man, right? Like, that's one of the big things, is that most people who are the level of rich that Phil Knight is don't care about their college, right? Like, they don't. The people who care about their college typically are like, the people who are like high 100 millionaires, right? Or mid-level 100 millionaires, people who have a ton of money, don't get me wrong. But like, aren't necessarily the people who are like, Phil Knight's in like the tens of billions of dollar range, right? Like it's just a different kind of animal. And like right now, Phil Knight is valued at $40 billion. And most like mega boosters for other organizations are like, I have $700 million. And I want you to understand how much more $40 billion is than $700 million. Not even counting the way that Oregon can use Nike in recruiting in terms of obviously access
and
to
the connections that it brings too, because it's not just Phil, I mean, Phil's the benefactor, no doubt. He's the big money guy. He's the Nike guy. He's the one that gets you from A to B. But yeah, I mean, he gets you from A to B to C to all these other people too.
100%. And so it's such a confluence of this moment. And the thing is too, I mean, we can talk about salary cap or whatever, like they can still sign guys to Nike deals if they want to. There's so many ways to get around something like that, especially if you're at Oregon. Like I'm fascinated to see, even actually to make the comparison to Alabama, right? Like they have a consortium of rich guys. Absolutely. They're never going to be hurting for money, but they don't have like the corporate interests that Oregon has the ability to leverage. It's just a different kind of animal being in your neck of the woods versus being in Birmingham, Alabama. So it's, I think, a fascinating way to look at it. And actually, even I think we can take this more existential on the Big Ten side of things, because historically in the SEC, what they have more than anything is access to talent and fervency, right? Like they have a level of interest and rabidness, you could say, that I think has been a huge driver historically. Well, when you look at the Big Ten, and we made a lot of it last year, that this was the first Northern v. Northern national title game since 2014, and only the second, basically in history. I think that like you look at these Big Ten teams, there are so many metros that are tied to Big Ten teams. There's so much population and overall money, right? With a Michigan, with Columbus, Ohio, with all these sorts of things. Of course, the access to Portland with Oregon, the access to Seattle with Washington. So I mean, I think that it's again, and we've obviously strayed off the topic of Oregon in some ways, but I think that there's so many ways that Oregon is emblematic of what the Big Ten can be if they play their cards right. And so I do want to, again, get back a little bit to the football field as well. So last year and the last 2 years, Bo Nix was a starting quarterback over there, and he was at Auburn a flawed football player who they managed to put in good situations. How have you seen that transition so far with Dillon Gabriel?
I honestly think that Dillon is like a best case scenario for them, right? It's somebody that comes in with the level of experience that he does, with the obvious and direct connections to a legend in the program in Marcus Mariota. But obviously being friends with Marcus Mariota is not going to win you football games or throw touchdown passes. I think that a roster built around you that can be adjusted in terms of Will Stein's offense, and a few buttons pressed here and there and notches turned to fit your style as a QB. You saw how it worked for somebody like Bo Nix. He's in the NFL. He got picked by the Denver Broncos. He had an incredible season last year for the Ducks. And that's not to say that he didn't do that himself. He absolutely did. He's a talented guy. He's a workmanlike person. I think you could say the same about Dillon Gabriel. But this is one of those situations with an elite receiving core, with a lot of experience in the backfield, with maybe a couple of holes to fill on the offensive line, but otherwise a very well recruited position with a lot of maulers up front for them. This is an opportunity for Dillon Gabriel to succeed and thrive without having to be like this, all world unstoppable Lamar Jackson level, like carrying the team on your shoulders type of dude. He's in an elite program and is going to have the ability to show off his skills, build his NFL draft stock, and be the type of guy that fits well. If he stays healthy, that offense is going to be very good. Oregon's defense, I think, is better than its offense, but we can obviously talk about that more in depth.
Yeah, they brought in Evan Stewart as well. I always forget about that. Like, it's not like he's going to have
Yeah.
no shortage of weapons. And of course, we were just talking about Jabbar Muhammad. That's where he headed. He's now going to be part of that defense. My goodness. One thing I just wanted to also note, I was just thinking about the way the calendar worked out because obviously everyone's talking about the Ohio State game. It's on October 12th. October, 2 days, like roughly a year earlier, was that first Washington game. And of course, they met again in the Pac 12 title game. So, are we going to have that same situation? We're going to see these two teams play in mid-October, and then we're going to see them play again at the end of December, probably the end of November, early December. Um, it's intriguing to see how this might play out. But yeah, so I mean, Sean, I know you probably want to maybe even dig a little deeper on some of this
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I think that I'm curious from your perspective, right? Like, this is a team, and we are in the level of nitpicking Oregon because we're trying to ask, like, are they going to be a national championship team, right? Like, this is not, hey, can they be good? This is like, can they win the national championship and beat Ohio State? It's a little weird, just like the slightest bit weird to me, the struggles that Lanning has had in sort of those like top end games, right? Like he never beat Washington while he was there, never beat Kalen DeBoer while he was there. Of course, the Georgia game, you kind of just throw that out. It's not that big a deal. They lose the weird Oregon State game too. Like that's one that they shouldn't have lost, that they blew a lot of stuff and ended up choking away. So Kalen DeBoer is gone. We do have to say that, but they replace him with Ryan Day in Ohio State as well, who they might have to play twice, like Bobak alluded to. Is is there any is there anything to that, or is that just it? Because I mean, I would have argued heading into the games last year that Oregon was the better overall team than Washington in both of those matchups, and both times. I mean, I don't want to say that they got out coached, and also Kalen DeBoer is like, I mean, I have him like in my top 5 coaches in college football, but I'm curious from your perspective, how do you think that Oregon is going to react when they meet those moments? And also, by the way, into the college football playoff.
I think that they are built for the long term and are lucky in some ways, but also it's just the way that it is that the college football playoff is now 12 teams and that they no longer have to walk on this tightrope where, like, hey, if you're out west, if you're in the Pac 12 and you don't win every single game or like lose one game and then win your conference, you're not getting in the college football playoff. I think Oregon was a better team on paper than Washington last year. They lost those two games. Washington firmly proved themselves as the better team. But in the scenario where last year was a 12 team college football playoff, I think that you get Washington a third time as the Ducks. And this is, of course, everybody's going to, Reddit everywhere else. It's like, they're going to like, oh, you're retconning. Like, you're like trying to like say that like in this scenario, it would have been good. Give them a third chance. Like if only the NBA finals had a game 8, it's like, no, like this is the new structure behooves the ability to build your team in such a way that even if you're contending in those games, let's say they lose the Ohio State game at home this year, that does not by any means remove them from college football playoff contention at all. In fact, they could go back and win the Big Ten championship against that same Ohio State team. And even if they don't do that, even if their only 2 losses of the season are those 2 games against the Buckeyes, they're still probably in. They're still like on the edge at the very least, and probably in regardless, and still built in such a way that they could make a deep run and maybe win the whole dang thing. So because they don't exist on that tightrope anymore, talking about your point, with the big games and, can Dan Lanning win the big game? He doesn't have to win every big game anymore, but he, I think, has built a team that can. I think it, they could go undefeated, certainly, but they don't have to anymore. And that's the crazy thing, is that the tightrope is a little thicker.
Let me close with this. For Oregon, let's say that we're sitting there on in Atlanta on January 20th, and Dan Lanning's holding up the trophy. What changed? Because I think that people see them as a team that right now is confidently in the top 4 or 5, but don't necessarily see them as they see them as half a step behind Ohio State and Georgia, especially. If they win the title, What's the thing that changed to make that happen?
I think it was the landscape that changed, not necessarily what Oregon is or has been. I think Oregon historically for the last 20 years has been one of the best programs in college football. I think that they have lost big games either to the credit of the teams they were playing or a confluence of different factors, or they came up just short, or Michael Dyer rolled over somebody, or whatever happened over those years. They've been a little unlucky, but they've also come up short just because they came up short and they weren't good enough. Either way, I think they are in that tier and have always been in that tier of perennial, and not always as in like every single year, but through those 2 decades of perennial contenders. And this is their opportunity to put their stamp on this new era of college football and say, hey, this is what it's always been about, ladies and gentlemen. It's always been about the moolah. It's always been about the way that you recruit and your attitude and the leadership style of your coach and all these superlatives and everything else. It would be a historic moment, obviously, for the state of Oregon, which has not seen a lot of national championships or NBA championships or a lot of other professional or college sports championships outside of course, the Portland Thorns, who are perennial champions in the NWSL. Um, it would be a great moment for the state. It would be a great moment for the Oregon football program, and it would be proof positive that somebody like Dan Lanning is the type of person that you want leading your program. Um, there's obviously a bit of a darker undercurrent, right? And this is something that folks will talk about all year long, and it'll continue to evolve, which is that college football now is this sort of unstoppable capitalist enterprise that people will, if Oregon wins the national championship, point to that as an excuse, like, oh well, they could only win when you could throw millions of dollars at these teenagers, and in the real era of college football, they never won a national championship. That'll be part of the conversation, but it'll also be a signal that, look, like this model is here and it is here to stay. And whether you like it or not, whether you think it is a benefit to the culture around the sport or not, that's a long and deep debate that folks will have. But it will signal something very positive for folks in Oregon, and something that they'll be really excited about in general.
That was a great way to wrap this up. I really, I think that's some great insight there. And I know those folks out there who follow you. In fact, let's close with that. Ryan, tell our listeners how they can read your work, find you, and follow you on social media.
Sure. Well, you can read all of our Ducks coverage, myself and James Crepia, covering the Ducks this year for the Oregonian at OregonLive.com/Ducks. That's where everything will appear. Day-to-day stuff, deep features, full coverage of U of O this year as they transition into the Big Ten, coverage of the Big Ten as we get closer to the season. We have a podcast, Ducks Confidential, that will be going more regularly as the season goes along. And then I also host Soccer Made in Portland to talk about the Timbers and Thorns for you sickos out there that love MLS, or the people who are following a growing and exciting league in NWSL. Hop on there, listen to that one. And then Twitter/X, Ryan T. Clarke. That's me. You can find me there talking all that stuff.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, Ryan. This is a great conversation. And want to thank all of you who've been listening to us. This has been a fun series to have. And this is a great episode to wrap up our coverage of the Big Ten in this series. I'm going to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Hyeri, part of the group that runs Reddit CFB. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Take care.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.